In anime, a litany of different weapons are used, depending on what anime you're talking about. In more modern anime like Black Lagoon, Gun Gale Online, Monster, characters usually end up relying on guns for their weapons. However, that's not always the case. In anime, we've seen everything from flying clubs to shark swords to hammers being used as weapons. Pretty much every single time, so long as it looks cool and it operates in a way that makes sense, I'm gonna love it. However, amongst all the weapons in anime, there is one that's used more than any other. And therefore, the weapon of choice for most anime characters is the sword. Now, obviously, this is heavily tied into Japan's cultured and long history with swords, whether it be the refinement of the process of making katanas, the banning of all blades not used in cooking, or just the general love for the Edo period and the samurai that came from it. It is undeniable that if you were going to associate one weapon with anime, it would be a sword. Now, as to whether or not that sword's a katana or a buster sword, I can't say. There's about as many buster swords as there is katanas and all the other variation of swords in the middle. But when it comes down to it, if it's metal, long, and sharp, it's a sword. At least for today's video. But with all these different characters scattered across multiple different universes, it's hard to say who the greatest swordsman amongst all of them is. Yeah, some universes are stronger than others, and yeah, some of the characters use swords in ways that swords probably shouldn't be used. And therefore, if you really wanted to sit down and talk about who the strongest out of all of these swordsmen were, well, the answer would be relatively simple. However, today, I don't want to talk about the strongest anime swordsman, because the ability to cut a world in half with your sword just because you so happen to be in a universe where universes explode when somebody snaps their fingers doesn't make you a great swordsman, in my eyes at least. See, because if you wanted to get truly granular with it, probably the strongest swordsman in all of anime is Trunks, and he uses a sword, what, twice? And thus today I want to talk about something a bit more subjective. Because today, I want to talk about the greatest anime swordsman of all time. The swordsman in anime who truly rise above the rest in their universe. The swordsmen who dazzle us and their opponents with their fantastic swordplay. Characters who seem invincible so long as they have their weapon of choice. Because today, we're talking the top 10 greatest swordsmen in anime, ranked and explained. But before we get to ranking or explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel that I just created with Stephen Heat, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Now, when doing a somewhat subjective ranked and explained video with this many possible entries, we're gonna have to lay down a couple of rules. See, unfortunately, when it comes down to it, the greatest swordsman of all time isn't super specific. And therefore, there's probably going to be some swordsmen on this list at the higher ends who would lose the swordsmen at the lower ends. In fact, a lot of the strongest swordsmen on this list are towards the bottom. And this is done because the criteria for this video is not strength. See, I'm taking more than a couple of things into effect when I'm trying to figure out who the greatest swordsman in anime is, where they rank in their own universe, how dominant they are in their own universe, and how reliant on swordplay they are. See, because for this video, I'm only going to be taking one swordsman from each universe. While obviously I could have Sasuke and Killer Bee and Zabuza and Kisame all on this list, there are so many incredible anime swordsmen from so many incredible different anime, I don't want to clog up this list with entries from the same universe. And when you consider how many anime revolve around the concept of swordplay, and how in those certain anime there's always somebody who sits atop the hierarchy, I want to take those people into consideration long before I consider the third best swordsman from Naruto. On top of this, there may be some incredibly powerful characters out there who do use swords occasionally who aren't on this list. And that's because I'm viewing having a bag deeper than just swordplay as a detractor. How can I consider you one of the greatest swordsmen of all time when you're more reliant on other things? Some notable exclusions will be people like Sasuke and Trunks. While yes, they do both use swords in incredibly pivotal and cool moments, Sasuke's got a Susanoo and a Rinnegan and Taijutsu and a hawk and a snake. And Trunks has his martial arts and ki blasts. While I'll absolutely make no arguments against the fact that both of them aren't fantastic swordsmen, I can't in good faith place them above people who are entirely reliant on the usage of their sword. Now, one day off in the distant future, when everybody forgets I made this video, and honestly, that's not that far for the future, you guys forget things pretty quickly, I'll do a top 10 strongest swordsmen of all time, assuming this video does well, where we throw Sasuke and Trunks at the top because they use swords occasionally and they're planet busters. But as it currently stands, I'm talking greatest, and you're just gonna have to be okay with that. But enough with with all that preamble, let's get into our list, with our first entry, which is actually an honorable mention. That would be none other than Ryuko Matoi from Kill La Kill. Now, there are a couple of things keeping Ryuko off this list. One, the fact that her sword is technically a pair of scissors, and two, the fact that even within the confines of her own universe, she may not be the strongest swordsman. Swordswoman. We're gonna stick with swordsman. Herstory. See, Ryuko starts off this story as an incredibly unpolished swordsman, using her anger and her thirst for vengeance to try to slash through Honnouji Academy, as she looks for the twin to complete her red scissor blade. And by finding the other half to her scissor blade, finding the person who murdered her father. See, even prior to the acquirement of Senketsu, her sentient sailor uniform, Ryuko Matoi had the ability to defeat multiple one-star students at Honnouji Academy. Students who existed on the bottom echelon of Honnouji Academy's government, but still held a fair amount of power. However, as Ryuko continued to synchronize with Senketsu and got stronger and stronger, she slowly but surely gained a level of mastery over scissor blade techniques. And when she's eventually able to think of herself as a life fiber hybrid, she's able to bypass all human limitations, slicing entire buildings in half with a swing of her scissor blade. Now, the scissor blade within the confines of Kill La Kill is able to do something that should be impossible: destroying life fibers. And once Ryuko is able to obtain the other half of her scissor blade from Nui Harume in episode 22, her power effectively doubles. And when you tie all of this into the fact that she's able to access something known as decapitation mode, where she's able to mechanically extend her own scissor blade into that of a two-handed weapon, increasing her range and power, Ryuko Matoi was absolutely a force to be reckoned with by the end of the story. But so was Satsuki Kiruin, who was also an incredibly established swordsman. And since Ryuko never really got a leg up on Satsuki Kiruin in terms of swordsmanship, it's hard to say that she's even the best swordsman in her own universe, and thus she gets an honorable mention. However, coming up in our number 10 spot, we have somebody who is undoubtedly the greatest swordsman in their universe, because coming up at number 10, we have Arthur. Now, a lot of you are probably saying,
Nick, Arthur at number 10, he's a planet buster. How could you put him that low?
Remember what we talked about earlier. Arthur is an incredible swordsman, and out of all of the swordsmen on this list, he's actually probably the strongest. However, Arthur's strength is not entirely tied into his swordsmanship. Yes, obviously the plasma sword that Arthur channels his energy through is a large reason why he's powerful. As with his superheated plasma sword, he's able to cut through basically everything, the Earth included, which is why by the end of Fire Force, Arthur is undoubtedly the strongest character in the universe outside of Shinra Banshoman, but his strength is more tied into his speed and strength than his swordsmanship itself. See, Arthur is beat multiple times by Dragon, and these multiple defeats force Arthur to become a stronger Fire Force fighter, and this is something that Arthur absolutely achieves, because as Arthur gets stronger, he also gets faster, until eventually he's able to react to things like Shinra's Rapid and Sho's Severed Universe, a technique that quite literally stops time. And by the end of Arthur's story, his most powerful attack, Violet Flash Earth Divider, allows for him to cut the Earth in half. Now, obviously, all of this strength came from the fact that he was a third generation, a firefighter with the ability to create their own fire. And Arthur is one of the few third generations who's able to superheat their fire to the point that they're able to create plasma. However, the only reason that Arthur is able to achieve the level of strength that he is his delusion. His delusion that he is King Arthur, a knight of the Round Table. And therefore, the only reason that he channels his plasma through a hilt is because it helps him feel as though he's a knight. Ties into the fact that his delusions don't allow him to wield his sword in his left hand, because King Arthur was right-handed, and you have a couple of holes starting to get poked into Arthur as a swordsman. Really, when it comes down to it, even though Arthur's swordsmanship does get much better by the end of the manga, what he actually gets better at is being fast and strong and delusional, until eventually he finds himself against a person named Dragon, so he can convince himself that he's fighting against the dragon as one of the Knights of the Round Table. So for that, he's at 10. And right above him at number 9 is Erza Scarlet, the S-class mage of the Fairy Tail Guild and the 7th Guildmaster. And on top of all of that, undoubtedly the greatest swordsman in the Fairy Tail universe. See, Erza's core ability is something known as Requip the Knight. An ability, like One Man Army in Modern Warfare 2, allows for her to switch her weapons and armor whenever she wants. It's a form of spatial magic of which she holds great mastery over. Her level of mastery allows for her to requip faster than anybody else in recorded history. In fact, she's the only sword mage in the entirety of the Fairy Tail universe who's known to be able to requip during combat. Not only is she fast, but her bag's incredibly deep, as she has 100 different armor sets and weapons, which she controls in a holographic inventory system that allows allow her to view and organize all of these armors and weapons in a weird little pocket dimension. But on top of the fact that Erza has over 100 different armors and weapons that she could wear with full mastery at any time, she's also a master of sword magic, which is kind of exactly like it sounds. Erza has the ability, depending on the sword that she's using, to launch different magical attacks with whatever sword. She's also able to combine different swords that have different magical attributes with different armors to achieve different effects. But as if she wasn't deadly enough, she also controls telekinesis, which allows for her to throw and control swords with her mind without touching them, making her an even deadlier opponent to face against. And really, everything that Erza has ever shown us when it comes down to her swordsmanship has been top-notch. She has access to over 100 weapons, all of which she has full mastery over. Now, these weapons include everything from swords to short swords to axes to lances, staffs, and so many other things. She has shown us that she's able to wield her swords with her hands and her feet. She's been able to slash through what should have been an intangible airspace created by Arya, deflect hundreds of needles simultaneously that were shot at her by Evergreen, slice through metal without touching it, only using the air pressure generated by her sword swings, and so much more. Now, I'm not even going to try and go over all the weapons and armor sets that she's used over the course of Fairy Tail's entire run. It's so many. But the level of mastery that Erza has over this many different weapons not only makes her one of the greatest swordsmen of all time, but just one of the best weapons users of all time. So you probably ask, why is she so low on this list? Well, she's a magic user. Well, obviously, a large amount of her power is heavily reliant on the fact that she's a master over multiple different weapons. The addition of things like sword magic and telekinesis do take away from her utter reliance on the weapons that she's re-equipping, though she is undeniably one of the greatest swordsmen in anime. And she is the only entry on the lower half of this list that if you wanted to put higher, I could not blame you. But enough about that woman who's singularly characterized by the fact that she loves swords. Let's talk about something entirely different. A woman singularly characterized by the fact that she loves swords. Because coming up at number 8, we got Saber.
Nick, that's a reductionist breakdown of both Saber and Erza.
I know, I'm just making jokes, leave me alone. It's called the segue. Now, technically, Saber is a catch-all term for a role within the Fate universe. So more specifically, we're talking about Atoria Pendragon, whose class name is Saber. Now, while there are multiple, and I mean multiple different Sabers we could talk about in terms of being the greatest anime swordsman of all time, most commonly reoccurring Saber is Atoria Pendragon. She is the pseudo-main character of not only Fate Stay Night, but also Fate Zero. On top of that, she's one of the key antagonists of Fate Heaven's Field. Within the Fate universe, Atoria Pendragon is considered the King of Knights, one who ruled over the battlefields in the Age of Legends. She is considered to be the greatest knight that ever lived, and therefore about as good as you can summon when it comes down to Saber. And is confirmed by the fact that Mordred, another Saber-class fighter, considered a first-class servant, still had lower stats than Atoria Pendragon. In fact, several different pieces of canon information confirm the fact that Atoria Pendragon is the strongest heroic spirit in the Saber class, which is why she was able to defeat the likes of Lancelot, who was considered to be the strongest knight of the Round Table, and Morgan Le Fay, a witch who was compared to the likes of Merlin. However, in the Fifth Great Holy War, she doesn't seem all that strong, and that's because her summoner, Shiro, is kind of an incompetent mage, and she's in a somewhat comparable position in the Fourth Great Holy Grail War, as Kiritsugu also struggles with providing her with magic. It's really not until she forms into a contract with Rin Tosuka, who's a competent and powerful mage, that Saber finally achieves the level of power that she had while she was alive. And with this level of power, she believes that she stands a legitimate chance against the likes of Gilgamesh, the strongest heroic spirit maybe in the entirety of the Fate universe. Now, all this is off the back of her incredible sword skills that come along with her Excalibur. Now, one of the things that made her so incredibly powerful was Excalibur, and its ability to turn invisible, making it impossible for her opponents to gauge her swing distance. However, True Noble Phantasm allowed her to generate massive amounts of magical power into her sword and strike them down using an ability called the Sword of Promised Victory. Now, this sword strike was able to destroy entire battlefields, but the magic of her Noble Phantasm isn't necessarily something we're taking into account here. When it comes down to it, we're talking about Atoria Pendragon's sword feats, sword skills that allowed her to fight against lancers like Cucullin, berserkers like Heracles, riders, assassins, casters, all to the point of either a stalemate or a victory. And obviously her sword being invisible played into a lot of these victories. It came down to it, Atoria Pendragon just out-swordsmanshiped a lot of these heroic spirits who are considered some of the greatest fighters of all time. And for that, she's getting the nod at number 8. But was she ever considered humanity's strongest soldier? Because coming up at number 7, we have Levi Ackerman. Listen, I know Saber should be above Levi. But when it really comes down to it, even though Saber is considered to be one of the strongest heroic spirits of all time, she had magic, and also she was fighting people her size. Levi Ackerman, whose nickname is humanity's strongest soldier, is a 5'4" Beyblade who sees 100-meter tall titans as easy pickings. I'm aware that what Levi does as a swordsman isn't what would be considered traditional martial arts swords play, but in that degree, it's almost more impressive. See, Levi's control over his ODM gear and the fact that he's constantly in the air and spinning around while trying to hit his targets makes the fact that he never misses his targets all the more impressive. Whether it's slashing through Jaegerists, cutting down pure titans, or charging the beast titan, in every single scenario, if Levi's on the battlefield fighting for your side, you feel pretty good about your odds. And this is why Levi Ackerman in the Attack on Titan universe is said to be as valuable as an entire brigade of soldiers. He's outmaneuvered several Titan shifters, like Annie as the female Titan, Zeke as the Beast Titan, who all know exactly how to protect themselves. And yet Levi just needs to Beyblade his way up an arm, cut off some fingers, slash out some eyes, and open up a nape, and then boom, Zeke's got a sword in his mouth. And really, when it comes down to it, Levi is kind of our first pure swordsman on this list. Yes, obviously you have to take into account the fact that he's got thunder spears and ODM gear, but when it really comes down to Levi's true abilities, it's using swords to cut through enemies hundreds of times larger than him, all while being just objectively a human, which to me at least makes him a more impressive swordsman than everybody else on this list. But doesn't make him as impressive as our number 6 entry, because coming up at number 6, we got Akame from Akame Got Killed.
But Nick, Akame doesn't cut down characters hundreds of times bigger than she is.
And while that may be true, and actually I don't know if that is actually 100% true, there's definitely some really big enemies in Akame Got Killed. I just can't remember if Akame's the person who kills them. Levi isn't fighting against other people who have magic. See, Akame exists in what is kind of a modern world, except instead of airplanes and the cell phone, the Akame Got Killed world decided to develop Imperial arms. And while these Imperial arms vary in what they do and how deadly they are all undoubtedly massively powerful. And yet Akame, whose Imperial arm is just a katana that kills people who she slashes with it, which is like objectively how katanas work in the first place, is considered to be one of, if not the most powerful member of Night Raid. See, Akame, whose Tegu Murasame, her Imperial arm, allows her to place a deadly curse on whoever she slashes with it, regardless of where she slashes them, gives her a massive advantage in her swords play. Obviously. However, the advantage isn't all that massive when you consider the fact that most of the time Akame is placed in combat against other Imperial Arm users, who usually have long-distance weapons. In fact, in the manga, the anime never covers this part, Akame kills a fellow master swordsman by the name of Erza very early on in the story to establish the fact that she is a fantastic swordsman. But at the peak of her power, after slicing herself with Murasame and giving herself the curse that she's able to reject and to use to make herself more powerful, albeit temporarily, Akame is able to go toe-to-toe with the likes of Esdeath, the undoubtedly strongest character in the entirety of the Akame Got Killed universe. A character whose Ice Imperial arms allows her to defeat entire armies with the flick of a wrist. On top of this, Esdeath was the first person in the history of Imperial arms who was able to create her own trump cards. And she made 3 of them. The first of which that allowed her to freeze time, the second of which allowed her to make an army of ice soldiers, and the third of which allowed her to draw all those ice soldiers back into herself and to maximize her own strength. And after Esdeath uses this third trump card, she's considered so incredibly powerful that she's considered a cataclysmic natural disaster. I mean, this is a woman who overpowered an army of 100,000 soldiers who had 10 Imperial Arm users. However, the ability to manipulate ice and stop time isn't all that Esdeath was capable of, as she was also an incredibly talented rapier user, which forces Akame at the end of the anime into an incredibly dangerous and high-octane sword fight, one of which Akame comes out victorious from. And while yes, a fair amount of this credit can be tied back to Murasame, Esdeath is literally the Imperial Arm killer. So Akame using an Imperial arms against her and coming out victorious is a massive win. But enough about these universes with magic and motion guns and belts that turn you into lions and really sexy lions, because coming up at number 5, we got Mugen, but like the original Mugen, not like the new Mugen, the Samurai Champloo Mugen, who looks nothing like Michael Jackson. Now, Mugen is the main character of Samurai Champloo, which is an entire story and a gorgeous one at that, about just being swordsmen. Now, while it's technically up to debate who the greatest swordsman in Samurai Champloo is it Mugen, is it Jin? And I think we all know it's Mugen. See, Mugen and Jin are supposed to be foils of each other, not only in personality, but also in their swordsmanship, as Jin's professionally trained martial art-based swordsmanship is supposed to run counter to Mugen's highly erratic swordsmanship. However, that's what makes Mugen powerful, his highly erratic swordsmanship, which is actually based off breakdancing. See, Mugen takes bits and pieces from all forms of martial arts and adds them into what he identifies as his martial art, which usually leads to him making up the moves he's using against his opponents on the go. But because of this, he's highly unpredictable and very difficult to fight against, like a drunken Rock Lee. He does things that nobody would anticipate, like blocking attacks with the bottom of his shoe. And Mugen is highly adaptable. In fact, if he ever sees an opponent using a move he likes, he adds it into his fighting style. And that adaptability is what allows him to battle against some of the strongest swordsmen and fighters in his entire universe, like Shoryu and Sarah. It's what allows him to kill master assassins and swordsmen like Denkabu and Umanosuke. I said that too fast. And while the story ends with Jin and Mugen having their final fated battle, which leads to a tie of sorts, I still believe that Mugen is the better swordsman. But I do love Jin. But enough about these universes where there may be two greatest swordsmen of all time. Let's talk about one where there's for sure a clear winner, because at number 4 we have the MC of one of the most legendary samurai manga of all time, Himura Kenshin. Kenshin is a Roroni, or a samurai without a lord, who wanders across Japan for a decade looking for redemption, carrying a sakabato, or a reverse blade sword, as he claimed that after being an assassin for the imperialist cause during the war that he fought in, that he would never kill again. Now Himura, even though he doesn't use a sharp blade and is actively trying to not kill his opponents, is still considered one of the most powerful warriors in the entire series. In fact, the only person who's stated to be stronger than him is the guy who trained him, who probably actually should be considered the strongest swordsman in the Rurouni Kenshin category. But if I was like, coming up at number 4, Hiko Seitaro the 14th, you'd be like, what the hell are we talking about here? Himura's skills were so incredibly important to Japan that without him, the War of the Meiji area probably wouldn't have come to an end. He's a living legend in Japan who's able to cut through steel, perform the act of Motoshigiri where he cuts somebody so cleanly they can be reattached as if they were never cut, and he was so incredibly powerful that at 14 he became an elite assassin for the government. His speed with a sword is so immense that he can often outpace trained eyes, and even though he only uses one sword, if his initial swing misses his opponent, he has a second sword that he uses, and he's equally as masterful in dual sword wielding. Now this way of fighting is referred to as Barojutsu, a technique that usually allows for him to cut down opponents in 1 if not 2 slashes. However, he's also very open and able to fight in prolonged battles, where he instinctively adapts to his opponent's style, finding the holes in their armor until eventually he's able to slice them down. This means that the second that he sees an enemy's attack, he's able to counter it and find its weaknesses. And because he is a pure swordsman who doesn't rely on magic and often doesn't even rely on killing his opponents, he is in most circles considered to be the greatest anime swordsman of all time. However, I don't tend to agree, because coming up at number 3, we got Guts.
Oh, Nick, what do you mean? How can Guts be above Kenshin? He's got the dragon armor. Without the dragon armor, he's not nearly as powerful.
And like, yeah, you know, that is true. The dragon armor does make him more powerful. Like, saying that the dragon armor is what makes Guts an incredible swordsman is just inaccurate. Ever since Guts was 6 years old, he's been training with oversized swords, which not only made him insanely strong, but also a master swordsman at a young age. Now, it helps that Guts is massive, coming in, according to some sources, around 6'8". But for a 6'8", probably almost 300-pound human being, Guts is incredibly dexterous, even without his dragon armor, as he often takes on much smaller and much more agile opponents in combat and either dodges their attacks or counters them. Mind you, with a much heavier, larger, and cumbersome sword, if you could even call it that. See, Guts, long before he got his dragon armor, was known as an incredibly powerful struggler on the battlefield, as when he was a mercenary in the 100-Year War, he gained infamy as the man who killed 100 Tudor soldiers. He was also the first human in 3 centuries to wound the Apostle. But after the eclipse, Guts is now able to hang with even the most powerful of the Apostles on equal footing. He's shown the ability to hang with the released form of Nosferatu Zod, who is probably the most legendary swordsman in the Berserk universe, and fought him to a stalemate as Griffith ordered Zod's retreat. But yeah, his Berserker armor does absolutely help. The odd in his armor, combined with his inner darkness, can turn him into a feral monster on the battlefield. On top of this, the Berserker armor stops his ability to feel pain. When you combine this with his Dragon Slayer, the giant hunk of steel, a sword made from the ultimate steel that allows him to cleave through anything he swings at with ease, even things like Grunbeld's cannon reflecting shield, or even go so far as to crack the corundum skin of an awoken Apostle. When it comes down to it, unfortunately, Guts just has more experience as a swordsman than a lot of people on this list. He spent 2 decades just in constant combat against fellow swordsmen, apostles, otherworldly monsters. So yeah, I'm giving him the number 3 spot. I want him to be happy, but not as happy as our number 2 spot, because coming up at number 2, we got Killer B. Oh, Nick, what are you talking about? Why would you put Killer B that high? I thought we weren't adding people who were relying on other things outside of swordsmanship. And yeah, you're right. I did say that. And yeah, you're right. Towards the end, Killer B is more reliant on his tailed beast transformation into Yuki than he is on his own swords. However, that doesn't for a moment take away from how incredible a swordsman he is. See, here's the thing about Killer B. It's always swords first. And well, yes, towards the end of Naruto, unfortunately, everybody turns into some variation of a chakra mech. One of the greatest fights of all time is Killer B versus Heavy. And it's one of the greatest fights of all time because of Killer B's swordsmanship. See, if Killer B used a katana like Sasuke or a giant sword like Kisame, I wouldn't have added him onto this list. But Killer B doesn't do either of those things. No, Killer B uses 8 swords simultaneously, going so far as to hold swords in his mouth, in his knees, in his elbow cracks, and spinning around so fast that Levi gets jealous. Not to mention he keeps track of all 8 of these swords as he throws them in the air so fast that somebody with a Mangekyo Sharingan and Sasuke couldn't keep up with it. And yet, he could. Do you know how insane that is? Do you know how insane it is to outpace a Mangekyo Sharingan with tracking ability with just regular eyes? Not to mention the fact that Killer B is able to add lightning release to any and all of these swords to increase their cutting ability, which allows him to slice through the Executioner blade, which at this moment is being used by, oh my god, I forgot his name, Suigetsu. This has been a long video. And when you consider the fact that Killer B isn't even necessarily being what appears to be serious in this battle against Sasuke and the rest of Heavy, and yet he still manages to effectively kill Sasuke in his base form with just his swordplay, that has to be genuinely one of the most impressive Naruto feats ever. Simply from a swordsmanship perspective, keeping track of 8 blades and using them effectively is massively impressive. Say what you will about him not using the swords enough, say what you will about him becoming more reliant on Gyuki, the fact that he, as Killer B, is known as a swordsman over a Jinchuriki speaks to his legacy and how incredibly powerful he is with those 8 swords. And I love him for it. But unfortunately, because of his reliance on his Jinchuriki transformation, I can't put him at number 1. No, at number 1 is none other than Dracule Mihawk, the greatest swordsman on Earth, at least in the One Piece world. In a wide-spanning and incredibly deep world dominated with sword fighters of all different kinds, there is one sword fighter that everybody unanimously agrees upon as the greatest, and that is Dracule Mihawk. Dracule Mihawk is squared off against some of the most impressive people in the entirety of the One Piece universe. Whether it was Jinbei, Zoro, the sword fighter from Whitebeard's crew, whose name I don't know, Mihawk has time and time again cemented himself as one of the strongest pirates in the world. In fact, prior to the Great Age of Pirates, Mihawk went around looking for legendary swordsmen, trying to fight every single one of them until eventually there was nobody left to fight him. Kind of like the guy who did the River Monsters show. He just caught everything. In fact, Mihawk was so incredibly powerful that he was Shanks' rival, and the two of them would often compete against each other in sparring matches until eventually Shanks lost his arm. His immense skill with the blade allowed him to easily destroy the entirety of Don Krieg's fleet, which was 50 ships and 5,000 men. He defeated Zoro with just his cross-shaped necklace knife, which the more you think about it, the weirder he's got it. In the War of the Best, also known as Marineford, he fought against Vista, I remembered his name, and Crocodile without receiving a scratch. And one of the truest testaments to his strength is the fact that when the 7 warlords of the sea were abolished, his bounty was set at 3.59 billion berries, which surpasses Luffy's bounty. He's cut entire icebergs in half with effortless slices, and launch air slices with his sword slashes that cut boats in half. He can deflect bullets with ease and slice through steel as he cut through Mr. 1. In fact, Zoro's improvement over the course of the 2-year time skip is largely tied into the fact that Mihawk was his teacher. Here's the thing, Mihawk understands that he's so much more powerful than Zoro that he's willing to train Zoro, whose singular focus in the entirety of the world is to defeat Dracule Mihawk. And when you're the greatest sword fighter in what is probably the deepest and widest universe in anime history, which revolves heavily around the usage of swords, then yeah, you're gonna get the nod for number 1. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Who do you believe is the greatest anime swordsman of all time? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, Like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I'm gonna go play Space Marines 2.